Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So this week we wanted to talk about how you can be kind of like us, independent developers who work for yourself without having a full-time designer or trying to minimize how much of a designer's time you need. Because oftentimes people who are working for themselves can't afford a full-time designer or much design at all from other people. And sometimes even when you can afford it, if you're working on like a small app or you need to get something out quickly or you're not sure of the market of something, you often want to keep your expenses on that app very low. And it's often hard to justify having a full-time designer or having lots of hours from a contract designer helping you out there. So we kind of wanted to talk about the reality and process of being a programmer who kind of does your own design, and having how that works out, and then other things later on about things like how you can do programmatic style assets versus static assets in your apps. So, David, what has your experience been with design for your apps?
So I do most of the core design of my apps myself, which is definitely it's a mixed bag in terms of what that ends up doing. But for the reasons you just outlined, it's a hard thing to hire a designer, especially I find for like at the first app or like the first version of the app, which is a little bit backwards in some ways. But for the way that I make apps, I don't know if the app I'm making is going to be worth putting a lot of time and energy and resources into. And so for a lot of my apps, like the first version is just a couple weeks of work. And like the concept of hiring a designer, even just like the time overhead, if like the cost aside, if I could find a really inexpensive designer, like the cost overhead in terms of time of going back and forth and trying to getting everybody on the same page and then waiting for the assets and doing all that, like it doesn't work as well for me. And so I tend to just sort of hope for the best and design things, and the result is maybe it's a bit mixed, and what I find though is at least like once you have some experience designing apps, like the core design questions, I guess this would be the UX design. I'm not really as familiar with the terms, all the different like UI, UX.
Please don't email us.
And like graphic design, maybe are the three kinds of design. I don't know. The making an app that sort of like works right and is functional and intuitive, that part I think I have a good handle on, and I can make apps that do that. They just tend to not be pretty. And in general, I found that people are pretty forgiving about things not being pretty. They'd rather it be functional, and so you can kind of get away with a lot more than you may otherwise have. And definitely this has been a lot easier since people don't expect apps to be pixel perfect anymore. Like there was a time when it was really hard if your app didn't have like the crazy textures and everything is just aligned just so. Like right now you're building an app that has to be, it's 4S size, iPhone 5 size, iPhone 6 size, iPhone 6 Plus size. Then you have iPad, you have 1X iPad and 2X iPad and iPad Pro. And so like your design has to scale to everything anyway. And so you can get away with, I feel like in some ways a lot more because you're trying to design something more fluid anyway.
Like in some ways it's more like web design, now, whereas before it was this very like texturally and graphically rich style in like the iOS 6 and earlier days. And then since the iOS 7 style UI with, all these clean, flat colors and thin text everywhere and lots of white space, I think it has shifted more into what web design kind of always was, where, you because you have to design for so many screen sizes and be ready to adapt to new ones that might come out that we don't even know about yet. Now you are kind of forced to make things simpler and more reliant on like text flow and stuff like that, and less about like these giant baked in images, and also those are just out of style now, which has been such a huge benefit to people like us who don't have or can't afford full-time design help. It's been a huge boon for us.
Yeah, but I think of course it probably ends up meaning that we become much more reliant on. I feel like there's a certain, and I don't really know where I learned these, and I think you actually have a better handle on these, so maybe I'll ask you, but like it seems like there's a certain basic set of like rules about layout, about how you structure like typography or the white space of a page, and to make it like look right. And when it isn't, it, at least at this point now, I have enough of a sense of it. Like I don't necessarily know why it's wrong, but I know it is wrong. And I pick that up just sort of as you go. But like once you, like, it's more important in some ways because things aren't pixel perfect, that you just have these basic like elements of good design under your belt. And this is something I noticed in all of your apps. Like as you've gone, there's always seems to have that nice, clean, sharp look. Where do you think you learned to do that?
Well, I mean, there's these different parts of design, right? So there's the like graphical artistry part of it, and that's things like textures, things like designing like rich icons, stuff like that. That part I have never been good at, and I probably never will be good at, and I'm okay with that. That part I'm happy to outsource and pay whatever it takes to get, you know, a great app icon made. You know, if the textures ever come back in style, I hope they don't. They probably eventually will. And you know, then I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, because that will basically drive my costs up substantially. But
it's all right. You can just have retro apps that are without texture. It'll just be retro. It'll be fine.
Yeah, it'll just become an affect rather than like, this is what people do. But you know, I think you know, so there's different parts of design. The graphical stuff I really can't do, but the rest of it, as you mentioned, like the rest of what you encounter in most app design, things like layout, basic text and typography, you know, spacing. That I've just kind of slowly developed my own sensibilities for that over time by, you know, some of it started in web design, but also just kind of paying attention and developing a feel for it over time, which is totally unhelpful. Like that, I recognize, like, if you're listening and trying to answer the question of like, how do I become familiar with the basics of design? Like, I don't know. I can't tell you that. There's probably some decent books about it that are made for this purpose. I'll try to find them and put them in the show notes if I can. But I haven't gone that path. I've just kind of slowly developed a sensibility by just like kind of paying attention to designers and to design, even though I've never really been trained as a designer or considered myself one. And a lot of it is just like kind of like, you know it when you see it. You know, like when you lay something out in a way that is visually pleasing, like you yourself will notice that this looks good in most cases, you know, like because you are also a person, you are also a user of this app. So you kind of like play with it. Following some basic principles, you can kind of play with it and work it out until it looks fairly good. But what you said is also correct. Like, people are very forgiving of this. I mean, God help you if you ever look up screenshots of Instapaper 1.0. It to some degree, in many cases, it doesn't matter as much as people think it does. Design is kind of like good marketing, where it is really nice to have. If your app is going to become big and successful, you probably need good design. But you can get an app out there and you can start building a market for yourself without having professional quality design. It is not like a strict requirement for success. And in many cases, in many markets, especially like the more narrow the market gets, the more specialized or professional a market gets, the less design is valued or the less it matters. And so if you're making an app like, you know, for somebody to get their job done, and, you know, it basically needs like 4 buttons and a text field, like, for, you know, then like it doesn't really matter to a lot of like whether that's really pretty or not is probably not going to affect your success in that narrow market as much as it would in like a mass consumer photography app, say. You know, so it really depends on what you're making and how much this is worth. But ultimately, you know, good design is something that if you can do it, you should do it, and if you can afford it, you should do it in almost every case. But that could be very expensive. I mean, like, you know, like hiring a professional designer could cost hundreds to thousands of dollars per day of their work. And it's really it adds up so quickly. Just to get an app icon made, you can get an okay icon made for a few $100s. To get a great icon made might cost a few $1,000s. I mean, again, this is big money we're talking about for independent programmers. Like, because most designers, most of their work comes from corporate clients. So you have to build in all these high prices. You have to account for how much of a pain corporate clients are to deal with, how much overhead you're going to have for every billable hour that you can actually get paid for. You have to account for all that and price things accordingly. Whereas, when you're an independent hiring a designer, these prices are often out of reach. So, it does help to familiarize yourself with the basics of design, or to hire a designer, for the stuff that really matters, like your app icon, and maybe like a once over of your main interface, but not to have somebody that you're like paying every single day or every single month ongoing. So it depends, and it depends a lot on the people you can find. If you can find a great designer who will take on your work for a price you can afford, great, that's awesome. But I have found that to be very difficult most of the time myself.
Yeah, because I think the difficulty there is it's the best designers are if you're not paying them well, then they're kind of ripping them off.
Right.
That's the nature of they're really if they really are that good, then they should be in some ways they should be well paid for their work and doing doing that probably with clients who can do it. And so you end up with kind of a lot of for small independent apps, it just doesn't. Yeah, the economics just don't tend to work out. And in some ways, you're probably better off. It's like rather than spending that money on that design, it's like, I don't even know, like training, buying yourself books, or spending the equivalent amount of time that you would have spent in money, just trying to practice and get better at it yourself, because that's certainly a skill that isn't going to go out of use or become useless to you. That if you're once you have a stronger sense of design, that's only going to help your programming. That's not going to ever come back to you or to bite you, to be like, oh no, now you know too much about design, like your apps are getting worse. Like it's a good thing to invest in if you can afford it, great. But I mean, my guess is you're probably then either working for a bigger company or just somehow very wealthy, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it also as can you afford any other kind of staffing or help? Like, if you can afford to pay other programmers to be with you to help make bigger and more complex apps, then the cost of a designer relative to other programmers is very reasonable. But if the idea of paying another programmer to help you out is completely out of reach because the economics aren't working out, it's probably also going to be challenging to pay a designer. Anyway. In much less expensive news, we are sponsored this week by Hover. Hover is quite simply the best way to buy and manage domain names, and it costs way less than hiring a full-time programmer or designer. Now, when you have an idea for a project, naming it can be difficult. Once you finally get that name, you want to be able to quickly and easily get the domains you need. Hover provides a simple, fast, and hassle-free method of buying domain names. It is very easy to search for new domains, search for domains that are available. You enter the phrase you want or some keywords if you don't know an exact name, and they will find available matches for you and show you a list of all the crazy new TLDs that are available with that name. They have, of course, the nice old ones, .com, .net, and all that stuff, but they also have all the crazy new ones, .plumbing, .coffee, .sexy, if you go that way. All these TLDs, they have recently lowered their prices on pretty much all of them. So .com domains are now just $12.99 a year, and all this includes free WHOIS privacy for all their domains. They believe that you should not have to pay extra to keep your private information private. And they have fantastic customer support if you ever need it. Hover offers a no-hold, no-wait, no-transfer telephone support policy. They are famous for this, and there's a good reason why. When you call them, you talk to an actual human being. There's no robots, no menus, but if you do prefer robotic communication, they also have great support documents and guides on their website for getting everything you need, as well as email support if you need that. Now, don't forget their Hover Valet service, where if you have a bunch of domains somewhere else, or just one, any number of domains you have somewhere else, you want to transfer them over to Hover, they will, if you want, do the whole transfer for you. Because I've never met anybody who said, you know what, I love doing domain name registration transfers. No, not a single person ever wants to do that. Hover will do it for you if you want. It's fantastic. There's so much great stuff at Hover. Check it out today. Go to hover.com to try them out. Use code SWIFT at checkout, and you will get 10% off your first purchase at hover.com, and show your support for Under the Radar and all of Relay FM. Thank you so much to Hover. Use code SWIFT at checkout for 10% off. Thank you so much for sponsoring this episode.
All right. So I think the next thing that we wanted to dive into a little bit is something that I've heard you talk a lot about this, and it's something that I know I've started doing a lot more in my own apps, is once you have your design, and this is especially for the graphical assets in your app, so like, button icons or images of any kind, like you can either pre-render that image, so like to have it come out of Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever design tool, Sketch, whatever it is that you're using, render it out as a PNG, put that PNG, and I will put all three of the PNGs, like the 1x, the 2x, the 3x version of that asset, and add it to your project and bundle it in that way. Or you can programmatically generate it, either as like in the draw rect of a UI view, or generating an image that you put in a UI turn into a UI image. And I think we've both been on the path towards less and less static assets and more programmatic assets. And so it's probably something that's worth talking about, some of the reasons why we do that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like for me, static assets are a liability for future work, because any kind of image, like, let's suppose I hire a designer to make like toolbar icons in my app, which I've done before, and it's often worth doing. So I have these toolbar icons, and then Apple comes out and says, oh, by the way, there's going to be a new iPad resolution. It's now going to be iPad at 3x. Then you need new versions of those icons that can be rendered at 3x. You can attempt to do it yourself, but generally you won't have like a source vector file. You will have like a stack of PNGs that the designer gave you when you paid them 2 years ago. And so you can try to make it or resize it yourself. It'll probably look bad. You probably shouldn't do that. So oftentimes you have to then go back to the designer and pay for even more of their time for them to do something that's really very trivial that they probably don't even want to do, because that's pretty uninteresting work. To just, dig up old files and re-render something out as a different resolution and everything. So it's this kind of clunky procedure that, like, if you rely on graphical assets that are baked into static images, you have all this liability whenever the technology changes under you. Or if you just want to tweak the design, like what if you want to make all the line widths, half a pixel narrower in the next version, in the next design? That becomes very difficult if you just have a bunch of images and you have to like re-render all those assets out. On the other hand, if you have all those images and stuff, there's a lot of upsides to that. Your app, first of all, will load faster because you won't have to be like drawing these things every time. Certain art styles are only really possible in static images and become pretty impractical to impossible to recreate with like quartz drawing commands in a draw rect function. So there are definitely advantages and disadvantages. Generally speaking, programmatically generated images make your app bundle very small. This is one of the reasons why Overcast is only something like 7 megs. It's a very, very small app bundle because I have almost no images in it. Almost everything in Overcast is generated procedurally. So it makes your app bundle very small. It makes it very easy to adapt to new devices and new sizes, but static images almost certainly will load faster. There's also like the OS will cache them. Any kind of like UI image named call, like those kind of things get cached. The GPU will cache certain things. The frameworks will cache certain things. So generally speaking, for speed of operation, you want static images, but for ease of programmer work, programmatically generated stuff can be a lot easier.
And I think the biggest thing too is with programmatic, it's there's even like probably just the philosophy of it, of making sure that like what you're saying. The biggest thing that I think you're pointing out is if your art assets need to be or are ideally in some format that you're going to be able to scale and adjust and re-render later, at the very least.
Right.
Like if you are using a completely like if you have a designer, or even if you're in with yourself, like if you're building things in such a way that you cannot just easily scale them up and down, like keeping them, having vector artwork in Photoshop or Illustrator or Sketch, or doing it in some way like that you can scale up and down, it's a ticking time bomb for at some point you're going to need something different. Like there was a time when we just had 1x everywhere, and then there was 2x and 1x, and then now there's 3x as well. And like it's always going to change. Everything, like one of the like, I don't know if we'll ever get to 4x, but something else is going to happen. Like all of a sudden, for a long time, I think I had the thought that the iPad was always going to be sort of 1024 by 768
right.
in terms of functional size. And it's like, no, it turns out they're going, because like when they went to the Mini, they kept the same resolution. They just smushed it a bit. And with the Pro, though, it's like, oh no, here's this massive new screen. And so like the most important thing is to be able to, over time, update have those assets be dynamic and to change over time, whether that's like rendered in your app, which like you were saying, like sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad, like it's some trade-offs, but whatever form you're doing it in, it needs to be something that you can very easily, if all of a sudden it's like, I need them at a different size, even if it's not a different resolution, even if it's just like, I think the alignment on this isn't quite right. I need to make it a bit smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Like being able to re-render that from source rather than taking the image and like resizing it, which is always never going to look good. Like you need to be able to say like, let's re-render this from the beginning in the exact dimensions that I want it to be. And if you can do that, like then your workflow is like good. If you can't, then you probably need to fix it because you're just waiting for at some point down the road it to come back and bite you.
Yeah, and even like there's a hybrid approach you can do here, which I've employed for all my watch assets. Because like in some contexts in the OS or in the frameworks, in some contexts you can't do a programmatic rendering of something. You have to have an image in the app bundle with a certain name. Like so things like your launch icons, like your app icon just can't be programmatic in iOS today. Other things like in WatchKit. There in WatchOS 2, I would imagine it's more flexible, but in WatchKit, WatchKit 1, many things had to be static images. Like there were certain things that
everything had to be
everything images. Right. And so with Overcast, what I did, like I have my themed buttons that are in the app, and those buttons are all generated by just calls to one of my appearance manager functions that in my custom appearance class, and you just specify how what size canvas to render this icon into, and the line width and the color. And some of them will display things like the seek buttons that have the number of seconds inside of them that will be sought, whatever it is. Like that's all customizable by the user, and so like those buttons just like there's a function that just says render seek button at this size with this color, this line width, and with this number in the middle. And the function has a text drawing call in it when in the middle of all these shapes. And by the way, Paint Code is a great app for generating the code for any kind of non-trivial shape. Recommend that. But then and then it just wraps it in like an image context where it just does a transform that scales it. So I can render this image that the source is in like a 100 by 100 grid or whatever I set Paint Code to, and then just scales that with CG code to whatever output size you wanted it at. And so when you have a context like WatchKit where you're required to have static images, I have a special build mode that I can set the app in where it just generates those for me in every configuration that it might ever need with my current code. So it literally just like calls that function and renders out static assets that I can then include in the app bundle. So that kind of hybrid approach I think has a lot of advantages. It is more complex. It will not save any space in your app bundle, but it will allow you to use these images in calls like image named and in context where you need static images, and it preserves all like the load time optimizations, the caching optimization on the platform. So the hybrid approach I think is worth considering. But ultimately, like I love doing things programmatically because I think you're right. Like it feels more semantically right. Like if I have a graphic that is just like a circle with an arrow going into it, like why does it need to be a bitmap file somewhere? Like why can't that just be represented as vectors? It seems as a programmer, and I recognize this isn't how design works, but it seems as a programmer that is like the most correct way to represent that is by vectors. And this isn't true for everything, of course, but so much of what we do today and the current styles of interfaces that is true for, and it just feels right. It feels right to represent it as a function, and even in many ways, like I mentioned my scaling technique earlier with these function calls. Like a lot of times, something really simple like drawing an X, like an icon that's just like a big X or a plus sign. Like I would I render that in a 1.0 scale graph, like it's 1 by 1, and it's like, all right, render for draw a line from 0.5 to 0.5, like, and then just render that to any size. Like that is actually easier and simpler to write and to conceptualize than having 16 different PNG files that at different thicknesses and everything. And sometimes you need the dynamism. If you offer things like if the icon has to be rendered at different colors, different fonts for any kind of embedded text, different line thicknesses, or if it's something that's being reflected in the UI that is some kind of dynamic element, like, if you have some kind of UI widget where you're showing progress, do you actually want to render out a progress bar at 100 different widths for all the different percentages, or do you, which I actually did for my watch app, or do you want to just have one that you can call a function and you can generate it at whatever value you need? There's obviously different needs here in different situations. Usually I prefer to go programmatic wherever possible for my image generation, because usually the downsides are either non-existent or very, very small, and the upsides are quite big.
And I think, too, one thing that I like about the more I've gotten into doing programmatic rendering is it keeps my it matches well with my ability. So if I open Photoshop, which I don't really have that much business getting into, but like I can do a lot of stuff there that probably ultimately doesn't look very good. Like I can over design and try and be cleverer than I actually am. Whereas when I'm like writing it even in paint code or just like in core graphics calls, like it limits and constrains me in what I find to be a positive way, that like I understand core graphics in a way that I don't understand Photoshop. And so it's constructive for me to like, okay, I can only do like 10 drawing operations or whatever it is like you can do in core graphics. Like functionally, it's like you can stroke a path, you can fill a shape, like there's a few basic things. And so if I make my art assets align with that, I'm probably not going to like reach beyond what I'm actually capable of doing. Whereas if I go into Photoshop and like, oh, I can do layer styles. Ooh, that's pretty. Ooh, let me go into this. Oh, I can blur this over here. Like doing stuff that I have no business doing. And so at least if I keep it as programmatic and simple, then I'm not exceeding that. And I understand it too. Like that's maybe another part of it. Like we're saying from the beginning of like, if you're doing this all yourself, like it's one of the dangerous things too, in some ways, is if you have if you're an external designer is making something for you that you have no way then of recreating
or adjusting
or tweaking. Like if I don't understand it, then I can't change it really. And that's just definitely come back to bite me a few times where I just need to change something slightly and I can't, because like it's a baked PNG. And so it's like I just have to make do, or I need to try and get back on my designer's schedule to make a really minor adjustment for them and work out the contracting for that. Like if it's nice and easy and understandable, it's probably going to be better down the road. And I think so for me, like this is where I'm heading. Like I do very few static images anymore. I tend to do a lot more programmatic things, or at least storing my assets in a form that I can easily re-render and regenerate. And I can look at it and I'm like, yep, I understand what that's doing. Like I see the lines it's drawing, the shapes it's filling, and like that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and the result of that usually isn't as good as what you can get with a pro designer.
Sure.
But it's one of those things where like you can get like 2/3 of the way there for a lot less cost and with a lot of other benefits. So like that isn't always worth it. Sometimes it is, and sometimes you don't have a choice. So it's nice to be able to do the minimum required with the resources you have, rather than being forced to go and spend a lot of money you don't have. So it's good to have this option.
Exactly.
All right, I think that wraps it up for this week. Thanks a lot to our sponsor this week, Hover. Thanks a lot for all of our listeners. Please recommend us to friends and rate us on Overcast and iTunes and everything. And we will see you next week.
Bye.